Picture this. It's the worst day of your life. A stranger just yelled at you in the middle of a crowded London street. Everyone's staring. Your heart is pounding. Your face is burning red. But instead of yelling back, instead of feeling that familiar rage bubbling up inside you, you do something completely unexpected. You smile. Not because you're crazy. Not because you're weak. But because you've discovered something extraordinary. A mental switch that makes you emotionally bulletproof. A switch that renders other people's negativity completely powerless over you. By the time this audiobook ends, you'll have that same switch. You'll never again feel controlled by someone else's anger, manipulation, or disrespect. You'll walk through life with a calm confidence that most people only dream about. And it all starts with understanding one simple truth that changes everything. What if I told you that you could go through your entire day without getting angry, frustrated, or bothered by anyone? What if I told you that the people who seem to push your buttons, the ones who trigger your worst reactions, could become completely powerless over your emotional state? Most people think anger and frustration are just natural reactions to difficult people and situations. They believe that when someone cuts them off in traffic, when their boss criticizes them unfairly, or when someone disrespects them, getting angry is inevitable. But they're wrong. The truth is your emotional reactions are not controlled by other people. They're controlled by you. And once you understand the science behind emotional regulation and master the techniques I'm about to share with you, you'll never be at the mercy of other people's behavior again. By the end of this audiobook, you'll have a complete system for maintaining emotional control in any situation. You'll understand why most people fail at emotional regulation. And you'll have the exact step-by-step process to stay calm, composed, and in control, no matter what anyone throws at you. Let me tell you about Thomas, a 37-year-old solicitor from Manchester, who came to me because he was on the verge of losing everything. His marriage was falling apart because he'd snap at his wife over the smallest things. His career was stalling because he'd gotten a reputation for being volatile in meetings. His health was deteriorating because chronic stress was wreaking havoc on his body. Thomas wasn't a bad person. He was intelligent, hard-working, and genuinely cared about the people in his life. But he had zero control over his emotional reactions. One Tuesday morning, everything came to a head. Thomas was stuck in traffic on the M60, already running late for a crucial client presentation. A white van cut him off without signaling, nearly clipping his BMW's front bumper. Thomas felt that familiar surge of rage. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He laid on the horn, rolled down his window, and started shouting obscenities at the van driver. The van driver, equally aggressive, brake-checked him. Thomas accelerated to cut him off in return. For the next 10 minutes, these two grown men engaged in a dangerous game of automotive chicken, weaving through traffic at speeds that could have killed someone. When Thomas finally arrived at his office, 45 minutes late, his shirt was drenched in sweat. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing so fast he thought he might be having a heart attack. He'd missed the client meeting entirely. His boss was furious. The client took their business elsewhere. A contract worth £200,000, gone because Thomas couldn't control his emotions for 10 minutes. That night, Thomas's wife sat him down and said the words that changed everything. "I can't live like this anymore. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around you. You need help, or I'm taking Emily and moving to my mother's." Thomas realized in that moment that his inability to control his anger wasn't just affecting him. It was destroying the lives of everyone he loved. That's when he found my work and started applying the principles you're about to learn. 6 months later, Thomas was a completely different person, not because he'd become emotionless or stopped caring about things, but because he'd learned to respond rather than react. He'd discovered that emotional control isn't about suppression. It's about understanding the mechanisms that drive emotional reactions and developing the skills to choose your response consciously, rather than being hijacked by primitive brain systems designed for survival threats that no longer exist. Let me share what Thomas learned. What you're about to learn. The strategies that transformed him from someone controlled by his emotions to someone who maintains unshakable composure, regardless of external circumstances. This isn't theory. This isn't motivational fluff. This is neuroscience, psychology, and practical technique combined into a comprehensive system that actually works. Thomas isn't unique. I've worked with hundreds of people who've applied these exact principles to transform their relationships, their careers, and their quality of life. And now it's your turn. Here's what most people don't understand about anger and frustration. It's not the situation that makes you angry. It's not the person that bothers you. It's the trap you fall into in your own mind. There are 3 deadly emotional traps that keep you reactive. And if you don't understand these traps, you'll remain at the mercy of every difficult person you encounter. Let me introduce you to Sarah, a 32-year-old teacher from Brighton, who was convinced that her colleague Emma was deliberately trying to undermine her. Every staff meeting, Emma would question Sarah's teaching methods. Every time Sarah proposed a new initiative, Emma would point out potential problems. Sarah spent hours complaining to her partner about Emma's behavior, lying awake at night rehearsing arguments she wished she'd made. The first trap is the personalization trap. This is when you take everything personally, when you interpret other people's actions as deliberate attacks on you. Sarah had fallen deep into this trap. She'd convinced herself that Emma's questions and concerns were personal attacks rather than professional feedback. In reality, Emma questioned everyone's ideas because she was genuinely concerned about implementation details. She wasn't targeting Sarah specifically, but Sarah's brain had created a narrative that Emma was out to get her. And once that narrative was established, Sarah interpreted every interaction through that lens. A neutral comment became a veiled insult. A professional question became a personal attack. A scheduling conflict became deliberate exclusion. This trap is devastating because it makes you the victim of everyone else's behavior. You're constantly scanning for signs that people are trying to hurt, disrespect, or dismiss you. And when your brain is looking for evidence that you're being attacked, it will find it everywhere. The reality is that most people's actions have absolutely nothing to do with you. That van driver who cut off Thomas in traffic wasn't thinking about Thomas at all. He was probably distracted, late for something important, or dealing with his own problems. Emma wasn't targeting Sarah. She was just doing her job the way she always did with everyone. But when you fall into the personalization trap, you give every person you encounter the power to control your emotional state. You make their behavior about you when it almost never is. Let me tell you about the morning I realized how deeply I'd fallen into this trap myself. I was at a cafe in Notting Hill, working on my laptop. A woman at the next table was having an extremely loud phone conversation, laughing and talking at a volume that made it impossible to concentrate. I felt anger rising. How inconsiderate. I thought, she can see I'm trying to work. She's doing this deliberately to be rude. I shot her several pointed looks, hoping she'd take the hint and lower her voice. She didn't. My anger intensified. I packed up my things more aggressively than necessary, making sure she could hear how disruptive she was being. As I stormed out, I heard her say into the phone, "Sorry, what was that? I can barely hear you. The noise in here is terrible." In that moment, I realized my mistake. She wasn't being inconsiderate of me. She was talking loudly because she was having trouble hearing her call. She probably hadn't even noticed I was trying to work. I'd created an entire narrative about her motivations and intentions, based on absolutely nothing. I'd made her behavior about me when it had nothing to do with me. This is the personalization trap in action, and it keeps you in a constant state of defensiveness, always ready to be offended, always prepared to feel attacked. The second trap is the expectation trap. This is when you have rigid expectations about how people should behave, and you get angry or frustrated when they don't meet those expectations. Sarah expected Emma to be more supportive. Thomas expected other drivers to signal before changing lanes. I expected that woman in the cafe to notice I was working and keep her voice down. But here's the problem with expectations. People are not going to behave the way you want them to behave. They're going to act according to their own values, priorities, and circumstances, not yours. When you have rigid expectations, you're essentially demanding that the world conform to your preferences, and when it doesn't, you suffer. Think about it this way. If you expect every person you meet to be kind, respectful and considerate. You're going to be disappointed regularly. Some people are having bad days. Some people lack emotional intelligence. Some people have different cultural backgrounds or communication styles. Some people are dealing with stress, trauma, or personal problems that affect how they interact with others. This doesn't make their behavior acceptable, but it makes it understandable. And when you understand that people's behavior is driven by their own internal states rather than by your expectations, you free yourself from constant disappointment. I worked with a man named James, a 51-year-old architect from Edinburgh, who was perpetually frustrated with his teenage son. He should be more responsible, James would say. He should keep his room clean. He should do his homework without being asked. He should show more respect. Every sentence started with he should. I asked James a simple question. Based on your son's actual behavior over the past 2 years, not on your hopes or expectations, but on his demonstrated patterns, is there any evidence that suggests he's going to suddenly start doing these things? James thought about it. Well, no. I suppose not. Then why do you keep expecting him to? I asked. Because that's what teenagers should do, James insisted. And there it was. The expectation trap. James had an idea of how teenagers should behave. And he was making himself miserable because his actual teenager didn't match his ideal teenager. Once James accepted that his son was going to be exactly who his son was, not who James thought he should be, everything changed. James stopped getting angry about predictable behavior. Instead, he focused on creating systems and incentives that gradually encouraged the behaviors he wanted to see. He stopped suffering because of the gap between expectation and reality. He started working with reality instead of fighting against it. When you release your expectations and accept that the people are going to be exactly who they are, not who you want them to be, you free yourself from constant frustration. This doesn't mean lowering your standards or accepting unacceptable behavior. It means distinguishing between what you can influence and what you need to accept. It means putting your energy into your own actions and responses rather than into trying to control other people's behavior through anger and disappointment. The third trap is the control trap. This is when you believe you can control or change other people's behavior through your emotional reactions. You think that if you get angry enough, people will realize they're wrong and you believe that if you express your frustration clearly enough, people will start behaving the way you want them to. The control trap is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. People don't change because you're angry with them. In fact, they usually become more defensive and resistant when you react emotionally. Your anger doesn't teach them anything. Your frustration doesn't motivate them to improve. Your emotional reactions often make situations worse, not better. Let me tell you about Rebecca, a 43-year-old marketing director from Bristol who spent years trying to change her husband's behavior through anger. Daniel had a habit of leaving his dirty clothes on the bathroom floor instead of putting them in the laundry basket. Every single day, Rebecca would find his clothes on the floor, and every single day, she'd feel her frustration building. She tried everything. She'd sigh loudly when she picked them up, hoping Daniel would notice and feel guilty. She'd make sarcastic comments about his inability to find the laundry basket. She'd occasionally explode in anger, listing all the ways he was inconsiderate and lazy. Daniel would apologize, promise to do better, and the next day, his clothes would be on the floor again. This pattern continued for 7 years. 7 years of daily frustration. 7 years of feeling disrespected. 7 years of arguments that solved nothing. Rebecca genuinely believed that if she just expressed her frustration strongly enough, if she made Daniel understand how much his behavior bothered her, he would change. But he didn't. Because Rebecca's anger wasn't a tool for changing Daniel's behavior, it was just making both of them miserable. When Rebecca learned about the control trap, she had a revelation. She couldn't control whether Daniel put his clothes in the basket, but she could control her response to him not putting them there. She had 3 real options. She could accept this quirk and stop letting it bother her. She could decide this was a deal breaker and leave the relationship. Or she could change the system rather than trying to change Daniel through anger. Rebecca chose option 3. She bought a second laundry basket and put it exactly where Daniel dropped his clothes. She didn't announce it dramatically. She didn't make it a teaching moment. She just quietly changed the system. Daniel started using the new basket immediately because it required zero additional effort. The behavior Rebecca had been trying to change through anger for 7 years changed in one day through a simple system redesign. The lesson? You cannot control other people. You cannot force them to be more respectful, more considerate, or more understanding. You cannot make them care about your feelings or priorities. The only thing you can control is your own response to their behavior. When you try to control others through emotional reactions, you're wasting your energy and setting yourself up for disappointment. These 3 traps work together to keep you in a cycle of reactivity. You personalize other people's behavior, seeing it as directed at you. You have expectations about how they should act, and you try to control them through your emotional responses. This combination is toxic because it makes you dependent on other people for your emotional well-being. It gives them power over your mood, your energy, and your peace of mind. The most successful people, the ones who seem unshakable and always composed, have learned to avoid these traps completely. They don't take things personally because they understand that other people's behavior is about them, not about you. They don't have rigid expectations because they accept that people are flawed and unpredictable. They don't try to control others because they focus their energy on what they can actually influence. Breaking free from these traps requires a fundamental shift in how you think about human behavior and emotional responsibility. It means accepting that you are not the center of other people's universe, that your expectations are not universal laws, and that your emotional reactions are not tools for changing others. Once you make this shift, you become emotionally independent. You stop being a victim of other people's moods and actions, and you start taking full responsibility for your own emotional state. To understand how to never get angry or bothered by anyone, you need to understand what's happening in your brain when you have an emotional reaction. Most people think emotions just happen to them, like they're struck by lightning. But emotions are actually the result of specific neurological processes. And once you understand these processes, you can learn to control them. Let me introduce you to Professor Michael Ashworth, a neuroscientist at Cambridge University, who spent 30 years studying emotional regulation. In his laboratory on Downing Street, Professor Ashworth has used brain imaging technology to watch in real time what happens when someone gets angry, frustrated, or upset. What he's discovered has revolutionized our understanding of emotional control. When something happens that your brain interprets as threatening, offensive, or frustrating, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, called the amygdala, triggers what's called an emotional hijack. This happens in milliseconds, faster than your conscious mind can process. Your amygdala floods your system with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, preparing your body for fight, flight, or freeze. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, and your thinking becomes narrow and reactive. This emotional hijacking served our ancestors well when they faced physical threats like wolves or hostile tribes. The ability to react quickly without thinking could mean the difference between life and death. But in modern life, your brain can't tell the difference between a genuine physical threat and a social slight. It treats criticism from your boss, a rude comment from a stranger, or someone cutting you off in traffic as if they were life or death situations. Let me tell you what happened to Professor Ashworth himself that made him dedicate his career to understanding this phenomenon. He was 28 years old, a newly appointed lecturer at Oxford. He'd spent months preparing a research paper on memory formation. He presented his findings at a conference in London. During the question period, a senior professor from Imperial College stood up and systematically tore apart every aspect of Ashworth's methodology. The criticism was harsh, public, and in Ashworth's view, completely unjustified. Ashworth felt his face burning. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. In that moment, his amygdala had taken complete control. His prefrontal cortex, the rational part of his brain, went offline. Blood flow was redirected away from the regions responsible for logical thinking and toward the primitive regions controlling emotional responses. Ashworth stood at the podium, unable to form a coherent defense. He wanted to argue back, to prove the senior professor wrong, but his mind had gone blank. All he could access were emotional reactions: anger, humiliation, defensive rage, but no logical argument. He stammered through a weak response and sat down, feeling like his career was over before it had really begun. Later that evening, after the conference, Ashworth's mind suddenly filled with brilliant counter-arguments to the criticism, detailed explanations of his methodology, references to supporting research, logical defenses of his approach. Where were these thoughts 3 hours ago when he needed them? The answer is that his prefrontal cortex had been offline during the emotional hijacking. His rational thinking capabilities had been temporarily disabled by his brain's survival systems. This experience led Ashworth to ask a question that became his life's work. If emotional hijacking makes us less intelligent and less capable precisely when we need our best thinking, how can we prevent it or override it? Here's what Professor Ashworth discovered. During an emotional hijack, your amygdala processes information much faster than your rational mind. It can identify a perceived threat and trigger an emotional response in as little as 12 milliseconds. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, takes at least 500 milliseconds to process the same information. This means you're reacting emotionally long before you have a chance to think rationally about what's actually happening. This is why you sometimes find yourself getting angry or anxious and then wondering why. Your emotional brain has already decided there's a threat and started preparing your body for action before your rational brain even knows what's going on. By the time you're consciously aware of feeling angry, your heart is already racing, your muscles are tense, and stress hormones are flooding your system. The modern world makes this problem even worse because we're constantly exposed to low-level stressors that keep our amygdala on high alert. Social media notifications designed to trigger outrage, news headlines crafted to provoke fear, work emails demanding immediate responses, traffic jams, financial pressures, relationship conflicts. Your brain is bombarded with signals that something might be wrong, which keeps your emotional alarm system in a constant state of activation. This chronic state of alert has serious consequences for your ability to think clearly and make good decisions. When your amygdala is constantly activated, it becomes hypersensitive. Things that wouldn't normally bother you start to feel overwhelming. Your threshold for emotional reactions gets lower and lower until even minor inconveniences can trigger major emotional responses. Let me tell you about Catherine, a 39-year-old solicitor from Leeds. Catherine came to me because she'd started having panic attacks at work. She'd be in the middle of drafting a contract and suddenly feel her chest tightening, her breathing becoming shallow, her mind racing with catastrophic thoughts. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Her job hadn't changed. Her workload was the same as always. But something had shifted. When we examined Catherine's daily routine, the pattern became clear. Catherine would wake up at 6:30 and immediately check her phone, news, emails, social media. Before she'd even gotten out of bed, her brain had processed hundreds of pieces of information, many of them designed to trigger emotional responses. She'd listen to talk radio in the car, getting updates on political conflicts and economic worries. At work, she'd keep her email inbox open all day, constantly interrupted by new messages demanding attention. By the time Catherine had been awake for 3 hours, her amygdala had been activated dozens of times by perceived threats that weren't really threats at all. Her nervous system was in a state of chronic activation. So, when a genuinely stressful situation arose, like a difficult client call or a tight deadline, Catherine's system was already maxed out. There was no capacity left to handle additional stress. That's when the panic attacks would hit. Once Catherine understood what was happening in her brain, she made some changes. She stopped checking her phone first thing in the morning. She switched from talk radio to music or audiobooks. She scheduled specific times to check email rather than leaving her inbox open constantly. Within 3 weeks, the panic attacks had completely stopped. Catherine hadn't changed her job or reduced her workload. She'd just stopped chronically activating her emotional alarm systems with constant low-level stressors. But here's the part that will change everything for you. Understanding that your emotional reactions are automatic doesn't mean you're powerless against them. It means you can learn to work with your brain instead of against it. You can train your prefrontal cortex to override your amygdala. You can build new neural pathways that support emotional control instead of emotional reactivity. The key is recognizing that there is always a gap between the trigger and your response. It might be microseconds, but it exists. And in that gap lies your power. That's where you can choose to respond instead of react. That's where you can take back control of your life. Professor Ashworth's research has shown that people who practice emotional regulation techniques actually change the physical structure of their brains. Brain imaging studies reveal that consistent practice increases the size and activity of the prefrontal cortex, while decreasing the reactivity of the amygdala. This isn't metaphorical, it's literal. Measurable changes in brain tissue. Your brain is plastic, meaning it can be reshaped through experience and practice. Every time you successfully interrupt an emotional hijacking, you're strengthening the neural pathways for self-control. Every time you choose a thoughtful response over an automatic reaction, you're making it easier to do so in the future. This is why emotional control gets easier with practice. The most powerful technique for preventing emotional hijacking is also the simplest. It's called the pause protocol, and it's your first line of defense against reactive behavior. Let me tell you about Oliver, a 29-year-old financial analyst from Canary Wharf, who discovered this technique completely by accident, and it changed his entire career. Oliver worked in a high-pressure trading environment where split-second decisions could make or lose millions of pounds. He was brilliant at market analysis, but he had one fatal flaw. When things went wrong, when trades moved against him or colleagues questioned his decisions, Oliver would react defensively and aggressively. He'd argue, he'd justify, he'd make excuses, and his reputation suffered as a result. One morning, Oliver was presenting a trade recommendation to the senior partners. A managing director named Charlotte interrupted him mid-sentence. "This analysis is fundamentally flawed," she said. "You haven't accounted for the regulatory changes coming next quarter." Oliver felt that familiar surge of defensive anger. He opened his mouth to argue back. But in that exact moment, his computer froze. The screen went blank. He had to reboot. Those 30 seconds of forced pause while his computer restarted changed everything. By the time his presentation was back on screen, Oliver's initial emotional reaction had subsided. He could think clearly again. He looked at Charlotte's point objectively and realized she was absolutely right. He'd missed a crucial factor. "You're completely right," Oliver said. "I apologize. I missed that regulatory change. Thank you for catching it before we proceeded." Charlotte looked surprised. Other analysts became defensive when she challenged them. But Oliver had just acknowledged an error gracefully and professionally. That moment changed Charlotte's perception of Oliver. Within 6 months he was promoted to a senior position, largely because Charlotte had advocated for him. She'd told the other partners, "Oliver is the only analyst I've worked with who can receive critical feedback without getting defensive. That's the mark of someone who can grow into leadership." Oliver had discovered the power of the pause accidentally. But once he understood what had happened, he started implementing pauses deliberately. The pause protocol is based on a simple principle. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your power to choose your response, and in that choice lies your growth and your freedom. Most even react automatically. Something happens, and they immediately respond based on their emotional state. Someone criticizes them, and they defend themselves. Someone cuts them off in traffic, and they honk aggressively. Someone disagrees with them, and they argue back. This automatic reactivity is what keeps them trapped in emotional cycles and gives other people control over their emotional state. The pause protocol breaks this automatic pattern. It creates space between what happens to you and how you respond. In that space, you regain your power. You remember that you have choices. You reconnect with your values and your goals. You allow your prefrontal cortex to come back online, so you can respond from wisdom rather than emotion. Here's how the pause protocol works. The moment you notice any sign of emotional activation, any hint that you're becoming angry, frustrated, or bothered, you implement an immediate pause. This pause can be as short as 3 seconds, or as long as several minutes, depending on the intensity of your emotional reaction and the situation you're in. During the pause, you don't try to solve the problem or figure out what to say. You don't analyze the situation or justify your feelings. You simply create space. You breathe. You allow the initial chemical flood of the emotional hijack to subside without acting on it. The first level of the pause protocol is the breath pause. When you notice emotional activation, you immediately take 3 deep, slow breaths. This is not just a relaxation technique, though it does help calm your nervous system. More importantly, it's a pattern interrupt. It breaks the automatic connection between trigger and reaction. Let me tell you about Margaret, a 56-year-old head teacher from a secondary school in Birmingham. Margaret had spent 30 years in education. She was respected, experienced, and genuinely cared about her students and staff. But she had one recurring problem that was damaging her effectiveness. When parents came to her office to complain about their child's treatment, Margaret would feel personally attacked. She'd become defensive. Her tone would become cold and formal. Parents would leave feeling unheard, and the situations would escalate unnecessarily. One afternoon, a father named Mr. Davies stormed into Margaret's office without an appointment. His son had been given a detention for disrupting class, and Mr. Davies was furious. "This is completely unjust," he shouted. "My son told me what really happened. Your teacher has it in for him. This is discrimination." Margaret felt her chest tightening, her face flushing, that familiar defensive anger rising. But instead of immediately responding, she did something different. She took 3 deep breaths. In through her nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out through her mouth for 6 counts. Those 18 seconds changed everything. By the time Margaret spoke, the initial emotional surge had passed. She could think clearly. She could see that Mr. Davies wasn't really angry at her personally. He was a concerned father who felt his son was being treated unfairly. "Mr. Davies," Margaret said calmly, "I can see you're very concerned about your son. Let me pull up the incident reports so we can look at exactly what happened together." The shift in Margaret's tone completely changed the dynamic of the interaction. Mr. Davies, expecting defensiveness and bureaucratic stonewalling, was disarmed by Margaret's calm, collaborative approach. Within 10 minutes, they'd reviewed the incident together. Mr. Davies could see that his son's account had been incomplete. The detention was appropriate. But instead of leaving angry, Mr. Davies thanked Margaret for taking the time to explain the situation clearly. That breath pause, those 18 seconds, had prevented what would have been a contentious, possibly complaint-generating interaction, and transformed it into a constructive conversation. Margaret started using the breath pause consistently, every time she felt that familiar emotional activation. Before responding to challenging emails, before difficult conversations, during heated staff meetings, she would pause and breathe. Her reputation in the school community transformed. Parents started describing her as approachable and understanding. Staff felt more supported, and Margaret herself felt calmer and more in control than she had in years. The second level is the physical pause. If 3 breaths aren't enough to regain your composure, you implement a physical pause. This might mean excusing yourself from a conversation, taking a walk around the block, or simply changing your physical position. Movement helps metabolize the stress hormones that flood your system during emotional activation. The physical pause is particularly important in heated conversations or confrontational situations. When you feel your anger rising, when you notice yourself wanting to say something hurtful or defensive, that's your cue to create physical space. Let me tell you about David and Jennifer, a couple from Southampton who'd been married for 14 years. They loved each other deeply, but they developed a toxic pattern in their arguments. Whenever they disagreed about something important or trivial, the conversation would escalate rapidly. Voices would get louder. Old grievances would get dragged up. Things would be said that couldn't be unsaid. They'd been to counseling. They'd read books about communication. They understood intellectually that they needed to argue more constructively. But in the heat of the moment, all that knowledge disappeared. One Saturday evening, they were discussing their daughter's school choices. David thought she should attend the local comprehensive. Jennifer wanted her to sit the entrance exam for a grammar school, 30 minutes away. The conversation started calmly, but within 5 minutes, voices were raised. "You always want to take the easy option. Jennifer said, "You don't want to put in the effort to give her the best opportunities." David felt that familiar anger surge. He wanted to fire back about Jennifer's impossible standards and constant criticism, but instead, he did something they'd agreed to try. He stood up. "I need a physical pause," he said. "I'm going to walk around the garden for 5 minutes." Jennifer, who'd also agreed to this protocol, nodded. David stepped outside. He walked around their small garden 3 times, the cool evening air on his face, the sound of birds, the simple act of moving. By the time he came back inside, his emotional state had completely shifted. He could see the situation more clearly. Jennifer wasn't attacking him. She was worried about their daughter's future. They were on the same team, even if they disagreed about tactics. "I'm sorry," David said. When he returned, "I understand you want what's best for Emma. So do I. We're both coming from love. Let's look at this together, rather than against each other." That physical pause had done what years of counseling hadn't accomplished. It had given David the space to shift from reactive defensiveness to thoughtful response. David and Jennifer started using physical pauses regularly. Their arguments became shorter, calmer, and more productive. They made better decisions together because they were thinking clearly rather than reacting emotionally. Their daughter Emma noticed the change. "Mom and Dad don't shout at each other anymore," she told her grandmother. "They take walks instead." The third level is the time pause. For more intense emotional reactions or complex situations, you might need hours or even days to fully process your feelings and determine the best response. The time pause prevents you from making decisions or having conversations while you're still emotionally activated. During a time pause, you might tell someone, "This is important to me and I want to give it the consideration it deserves. Can we continue this conversation tomorrow?" Or you might simply wait before responding to an email or text message that triggered you. The time pause ensures that your responses come from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. Let me tell you about Andrew, a 47-year-old software engineer from Reading. Andrew received an email from his manager on a Friday afternoon. The email said that Andrew's project, which he'd spent 9 months developing, was being shelved indefinitely. The decision had been made by executives who'd never even asked for Andrew's input. Andrew felt a combination of anger, betrayal, and profound disappointment. His first impulse was to fire off a strongly worded email, expressing exactly how he felt about this decision and the people who'd made it. He opened his email client and started typing. But then he remembered the time pause principle. He saved the email as a draft and closed his laptop. "I'll look at this Monday," he told himself. Over the weekend, Andrew processed his emotions. He talked to his wife. He went for a long run. He thought about the situation from different angles. By Monday morning, Andrew's perspective had shifted. He was still disappointed about the project being shelved, but he understood that business decisions are often made based on factors that individual contributors can't see. Budget constraints, strategic pivots, market changes. He deleted the angry email draft and wrote a different message. Professional, expressing his disappointment while also offering to document his work so it could be referenced if the company wanted to revisit the project in the future. Andrew's manager was impressed by his professionalism. When a new high-priority project came up 3 weeks later, Andrew was the first person the manager thought of to lead it. If Andrew had sent that Friday afternoon email, written in the heat of emotional activation, he would have damaged his reputation and career prospect. The time pause had saved him from a decision he would have regretted. The key to making the pause protocol effective is practicing it before you need it. Most people only try to pause when they're already highly activated, and by then it's much harder to interrupt the emotional hijacking. Instead, practice pausing during low-level irritations. When someone takes too long at the supermarket checkout, when you're stuck in traffic, when you receive a mildly annoying text message. Use these situations to strengthen your pause reflex. The more you practice pausing during minor irritations, the more automatic it becomes during major provocations. You're literally rewiring your brain to choose pause over reaction, You're creating new neural pathways that prioritize conscious choice over automatic response. The way you interpret what happens to you determines how you feel about it. Two people can experience the exact same situation and have completely different emotional reactions based on how they frame the experience in their minds. This is why reframing is one of the most powerful tools for emotional control. When you change your internal story about what's happening, you change your emotional response. Most people don't realize they're constantly telling themselves stories about other people's behavior. Someone doesn't return their phone call and they tell themselves a story that the person is rude or doesn't care about them. A colleague takes credit for their idea, and they tell themselves a story that the colleague is trying to sabotage them. Their partner forgets to do something they asked and they tell themselves a story that their partner doesn't respect them. These internal stories feel like facts, but they're actually interpretations. And since they're interpretations, they can be changed. When you learn to consciously reframe situations in more empowering ways, you gain tremendous control over your emotional state. Let me tell you about Helen, a 34-year-old nurse at Guy's Hospital in London. Helen worked in the accident and emergency department, one of the most stressful environments imaginable. 12-hour shifts, life and death situations, aggressive patients, demanding families. Helen had been doing this work for 8 years, and she was burning out. The problem wasn't the wardle itself. Helen had always been able to handle high-pressure situations. The problem was her internal narrative about patient and family behavior. When patients were rude or demanding, Helen would think, "They're treating me like I'm not a person. They don't respect the work I'm doing." When families were anxious and asking constant questions, Helen would interpret it as, "They don't trust my competence. They think I don't know what I'm doing." These interpretations triggered strong emotional reactions: anger, resentment, frustration. By the end of each shift, Helen was emotionally exhausted, not just from the work but from the constant emotional activation caused by her interpretations of patient and family behavior. Then Helen attended a workshop on resilience for healthcare workers. The facilitator introduced the concept of reframing. When patients or families are difficult, the facilitator said, "They're not usually reacting to you personally. They're reacting to fear. They're in one of the most frightening situations of their lives. Their behavior is about their fear, not about your worth." This reframe changed everything for Helen. The next shift, when an elderly man was rude and demanding, Helen didn't think, "He's disrespecting me." Instead, she thought, "He's frightened and trying to feel some control in a situation where he has none." When a woman kept asking the same questions repeatedly, Helen didn't think, "She doesn't trust my competence." Instead, she thought, "She's so anxious she can't process information properly." These reframes didn't excuse inappropriate behavior, but they transformed Helen's emotional response. Instead of feeling angry and disrespected, Helen felt compassion. Instead of emotional exhaustion, she felt purpose. She was still doing the exact same work, dealing with the exact same behaviors, but her internal experience was completely different because her interpretation had changed. The first step in reframing is recognizing that you're telling yourself a story. Most people don't distinguish between what actually happened and their interpretation of what happened. They think their story is reality, but what actually happened is just the fact. Someone didn't return your phone call. A colleague presented your idea as their own. Your partner forgot to do something. Everything else, the meaning you attach to these events, the motives you assign to other people, the implications you draw about their character or their feelings about you, that's your story. Once you recognize that you're telling yourself a story, you can consciously choose a better one. A story that serves you rather than one that makes you suffer. A story that empowers you rather than one that makes you a victim. A story that opens up possibilities rather than one that closes them down. Let me give you some examples of how this works in practice. Your manager gives you critical feedback on a project. Your immediate story might be, "She's trying to make me look bad." Or, "She doesn't appreciate my work." Or, "She's impossible to please." These stories generate feelings of anger, resentment, and frustration. But you could reframe the situation completely. Alternative story 1. "She's trying to help me improve my skills and advance in my career." This story generates feelings of gratitude, and motivation. Alternative story 2. She has high standards because this project is important to the company's success. This story generates feelings of respect and determination. Alternative story 3. She's under a lot of pressure from her superiors and is passing along feedback she received. This story generates feelings of empathy and understanding. Notice that all of these alternative stories could be true. You have no way of knowing your manager's real motives or the full context of her feedback. So, why not choose the story that makes you feel better and motivates you to respond more effectively? Let me tell you about Marcus, a 26-year-old estate agent from Manchester. Marcus was struggling with a colleague named Simon. Every time Marcus secured a good listing, Simon would make sarcastic comments. "Must be nice to get all the easy properties," Simon would say, "or some of us have to actually work for our sales." Marcus's story about Simon's behavior was, "He's jealous and trying to undermine me. He wants me to fail." This story made Marcus angry and defensive. He'd respond with his own sarcastic comments. The relationship had become toxic, affecting the entire office atmosphere. When Marcus learned about reframing, he decided to try a different story. What if Simon wasn't jealous or malicious? What if Simon was insecure? What if he was struggling with his own sales and feeling inadequate? That if his comments were more about his own pain than about Marcus? This reframe changed Marcus's entire approach. Instead of responding with defensiveness, Marcus started responding with generosity. When Simon made a sarcastic comment, Marcus would say, "Actually, I've been meaning to ask you about that property on King Street. You have so much experience with that area. What do you think the best approach would be?" This response, based on Marcus's new interpretation of Simon's behavior, completely shifted their dynamic. Simon, who'd expected defensiveness or counterattack, was disarmed. He started actually answering Marcus's questions. Over time, they developed a collaborative relationship. Simon's sarcastic comments disappeared because he no longer felt threatened. Marcus hadn't changed Simon. He'd changed his story about Simon, which changed his response to Simon, which then changed Simon's behavior. Here's another example. You're driving and someone cuts you off without signaling. Your immediate story might be, "That person is a selfish idiot who doesn't care about anyone else's safety." This story generates anger and stress. But you could reframe it. Alternative story 1. That person is probably dealing with an emergency and is focused on getting somewhere important quickly. Alternative story 2. That person made a mistake and probably doesn't even realize they cut me off. Alternative story 3. That person is having a difficult day and is not thinking clearly. These reframes don't excuse dangerous driving, but they prevent you from carrying anger and stress that doesn't serve you. They help you respond from a place of understanding rather than rage. The key to effective reframing is finding alternative stories that are both plausible and empowering. They don't have to be the most likely explanation, but they have to be possible. And they have to move you toward a more resourceful emotional state. There are several powerful reframing techniques you can use in different situations. The first is the ignorance reframe. Instead of assuming that people who behave badly are malicious or selfish, assume they're ignorant. They don't know better. They haven't been taught better social skills or emotional intelligence. They're doing the best they can with their current level of awareness. This reframe generates compassion instead of anger. Let me tell you about Patricia, a 62-year-old librarian from Bath. Patricia had a neighbor named Mrs. Thornton, who would park her car in a way that blocked Patricia's driveway exit. This happened 2 or 3 times a week. Patricia's initial story was, "She's doing this deliberately to annoy me. She's inconsiderate and rude." This story made Patricia furious. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes on Mrs. Thornton's windscreen. She'd make pointed comments when they passed each other. The feud was making both their lives miserable. Then, Patricia tried the ignorance reframe. What if Mrs. Thornton genuinely didn't realize her parking was blocking the driveway? What if she had vision problems or spatial awareness issues? What if she simply wasn't aware of the impact of her parking choices? Patricia decided to approach the situation from this new frame. Instead of another passive-aggressive note, she knocked on Mrs. Thornton's door with a plate of homemade biscuits. "Mrs. Thornton," Patricia said warmly, I wanted to mention something that I don't think you realize. When you park your car at that particular angle, it blocks my driveway exit and I can't get out. Then sure, you didn't know. So I wanted to let you know, so we can avoid any problems. Mrs. Thornton was surprised and embarrassed. Oh my goodness, I had no idea. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. I'll be much more careful. The problem was solved immediately. Not because Patricia had confronted Mrs. Thornton more aggressively, but because she'd reframed the situation and approached it from ignorance rather than malice. The second reframing technique is the pain reframe. Instead of assuming that difficult people are trying to hurt you, assume they're in pain themselves. Hurt people hurt people. People who are rude, aggressive, or inconsiderate are usually dealing with their own stress, insecurity, or emotional wound. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps you respond with empathy rather than defensiveness. Let me tell you about George, a 41-year-old taxi driver from Liverpool. George spent his days navigating the city streets, dealing with all kinds of passengers. Most were pleasant, but some were incredibly rude. They'd complain about the route he was taking. They'd make disparaging comments about his driving. They'd slam the door when they got out. For years George took this personally. He'd go home fuming about rude passengers. He'd complain to his wife for hours. The stress was affecting his health and his marriage. Then George's daughter, who was studying psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University, told him about the pain reframe. "Dad," she said, "when people are rude to you, it's usually not about you. It's about what's happening in their lives. Happy people don't treat strangers badly." George decided to try this perspective. The next day, a businessman got in his cab and immediately started complaining. The traffic was terrible. George should have taken a different route. This was taking too long. Instead of feeling angry, George thought, "This man is clearly having a terrible day. Something's going wrong in his life." George's entire demeanor shifted. "Sounds like you're having a rough time," George said sympathetically. The businessman paused. "Yeah, actually, I'm late for a meeting that could determine whether I keep my job. I'm sorry for being short with you." The rest of the ride, the businessman opened up about the stress he was under. When he got out, he gave George a generous tip and said, "Thanks for listening. You made a bad day a bit better." George started using the pain reframe with every difficult passenger. The rude teenager was dealing with bullying at school. The aggressive woman was going through a divorce. The impatient businessman was worried about his sick father. George couldn't know these things for certain, but assuming pain rather than malice changed how he responded to people. And often, his empathetic response would lead people to reveal what was really bothering them. George went home happier. His health improved. His marriage got better. Same job, same passengers, completely different emotional experience, because of how he chose to interpret behavior. The third technique is the learning reframe. Instead of seeing difficult situations as problems or attacks, see them as opportunities to practice your emotional regulation skills. Every challenging person is a teacher helping you become stronger and more skilled. Every frustrating situation is a chance to prove to yourself that you can stay calm and composed no matter what happens around you. Let me tell you about Fiona, a 28-year-old customer service manager at John Lewis in Oxford Street. Fiona dealt with angry customers every single day. Returns, complaints, demands for refunds. She'd come home emotionally exhausted, feeling like she'd been under attack for 8 hours. Then Fiona started using the learning reframe. Instead of thinking, "I have to deal with angry customers," she started thinking, "I get to practice staying calm while someone else loses control." Every difficult customer became a training exercise. How long could she maintain her composure? Could she stay empathetic even when someone was being unreasonable? Could she find a solution that satisfied both the customer and company policy? This reframe transformed Fiona's experience of her job. Instead of feeling drained by difficult cockadas, she felt energized by successfully handling them. She started keeping a private scorecard. Each day, she'd rate her performance on emotional control. Did she stay calm? Did she respond with empathy? Did she find creative solutions? Within 3 months, Fiona's manager noticed the change. Fiona was receiving more positive customer feedback than any other manager. She was promoted to train new staff on customer service. The job hadn't changed. The customers hadn't changed. But Fiona's interpretation of her experience had completely transformed. The fourth technique is the temporary refrain. Instead of seeing someone's bad mood or difficult behavior as a permanent characteristic, see it as a temporary state. Everyone has bad days. Everyone deals with stress and challenges that can affect their behavior. The person who's rude to you today might be kind and helpful tomorrow. Let me tell you about Richard, a 53-year-old dentist in Edinburgh. Richard had a dental hygienist named Claire, who was usually cheerful and professional. But one Monday morning, Claire was snappy and irritable. She was short with patience. She made sarcastic comments to Richard. Richard's initial interpretation was, Claire is becoming difficult. Maybe she's not right for this practice anymore. But then, Richard remembered the temporary refrain. What if this wasn't Claire's permanent character? What if she was just having a bad day? Instead of making judgments about Claire's character, Richard pulled her aside during a break. Claire, you seem stressed today. Is everything all right? Claire's eyes filled with tears. Her mother had been rushed to hospital the night before with a suspected stroke. Claire had been up all night at Royal Infirmary. She'd come to work because she didn't want to let Richard down, but she was exhausted and terrified. Richard sent Claire home immediately. Your mother needs you. We'll manage here. A week later, when Claire's mother had recovered, Claire returned to work, back to her usual cheerful professional self. If Richard had interpreted her bad day as her permanent character, he might have damaged or ended their working relationship. The temporary reframe had allowed him to respond with compassion instead of judgment. The fifth technique is the growth reframe. Instead of seeing criticism or feedback as attacks on your character, see them as information that can help you improve. Even if the feedback is delivered poorly or motivated by someone else's agenda, there might still be valuable insights you can extract. Let me tell you about Sophia, a 24-year-old journalist at The Guardian. Sophia had written an article about housing policy in London. The morning after it was published, her editor called her into his office. This piece has several factual errors, he said bluntly. You didn't verify your statistics. You made claims without proper sourcing. This is not the standard we expect. Sophia felt her face burning. Her immediate story was, he thinks I'm incompetent. He's going to fire me. My career is over. But Sophia had been practicing reframing. She forced herself to shift perspectives. What if this wasn't an attack on her character, but information about how to improve her work? What if her editor was investing time in her development rather than dismissing her? Sophia took a breath. You're absolutely right, she said. I rushed the fact-checking because I was worried about the deadline. Can you show me specifically where I went wrong so I can learn from this? Her editor's demeanor shifted. He'd expected defensiveness. Instead, he got receptivity. He spent 30 minutes going through proper research and verification processes with Sophia. That feedback session, which could have been devastating to Sophia's confidence and career, became a masterclass in journalism. Sophia's subsequent articles were rigorously researched and well-sourced. She became one of the paper's most reliable reporters, all because she chose to see criticism as growth opportunity rather than personal attack. The ultimate goal of emotional control is not just to manage your reactions in the moment, but to develop a deep sense of emotional independence. This means that your emotional state is determined by your own choices and values, not by other people's behavior or external circumstances. It means that while you can still be affected by what happens around you, you're not controlled by it. Most people are emotionally dependent. Their mood depends on how others treat them. Their self-esteem depends on external validation. Their stress levels depend on whether things go according to their plans. This emotional dependence makes them vulnerable to every person they encounter and every situation they face. It gives other people enormous power over their inner experience. Let me tell you about William, a 36-year-old architect from Bristol. William was exceptionally talented, but he had one critical weakness. His emotional state was entirely dependent on his clients' reactions to his work. When clients praised his designs, William felt elated, confident. worthy. When clients requested changes or expressed concerns, William felt devastated, inadequate, worthless. His wife Emma would watch his mood swing wildly based on a single email or phone call. It's like you're on an emotional roller coaster controlled by other people, Emma told him. You're giving them all the power over how you feel about yourself. William knew Emma was right, but he didn't know how to change it. How could he not care what his clients thought? His professional success depended on client satisfaction. The breakthrough came when William learned about emotional independence. This wasn't about not caring what clients thought. It was about separating his self-worth from their opinions. William started practicing what I call outcome independence. He would do his absolute best work on every project, applying all his skill and creativity. But he would not attach his emotional well-being to whether clients loved it immediately or requested changes. He preferred that clients were thrilled with his designs, but he didn't need them to be in order to feel valuable as a person. This shift was subtle but profound. William was still committed to client satisfaction. He still incorporated feedback and made requested changes. But his emotional state remained stable regardless of how clients responded. When a client requested major revisions, William would think, "Interesting. Let me understand what they're looking for and how I can deliver that," rather than "I've failed. My work isn't good enough." The results were remarkable. First, William's health improved dramatically. He slept better. His chronic tension headaches disappeared. His relationship with Emma strengthened because he wasn't bringing emotional volatility home every day. But something else happened that surprised William. His client relationships actually improved. When William was emotionally dependent on their approval, his neediness had been subtly off-putting. He'd been defensive about feedback. He'd over-explain his design choices. He'd seek constant reassurance. But once he became emotionally independent, he became more confident and collaborative. He could hear criticism without becoming defensive. He could advocate for his design choices without being attached to clients agreeing with him. Clients felt his confidence and trusted him more. William's business grew because he'd become emotionally independent. The foundation of emotional independence is understanding the difference between what's in your control and what's not. You cannot control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it. You cannot control external circumstances, but you can control your attitude toward them. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control what you do about it. This understanding leads to what I call the detachment system. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care about outcomes or relationships. It means you don't attach your emotional well-being to things you cannot control. You care about your work, but you don't attach your self-worth to whether your boss appreciates you. You care about your relationships, but you don't attach your happiness to whether others always treat you well. Let me tell you about the 4 principles of the detachment system. The first principle is emotional self-sufficiency. This means that you meet your own emotional needs rather than depending on others to meet them for you. If you need validation, you validate yourself. If you need security, you create it through your own actions and mindset. If you need love, you start by loving yourself unconditionally. Most people seek these emotional needs from external sources, which makes them vulnerable to disappointment and manipulation. Let me tell you about Jessica, a 29-year-old marketing executive from Newcastle. Jessica constantly needed reassurance from her boyfriend Daniel that he loved her and was committed to their relationship. Multiple times a day, she'd ask, "Do you still love me? You're not going to leave me, are you?" At first, Daniel would patiently reassure her. But over time, the constant neediness became exhausting. Jessica's emotional dependence was pushing Daniel away. The more insecure she felt, the more reassurance she needed. The more reassurance she needed, the more exhausted Daniel became. The more exhausted Daniel became, the more distant he seemed. The more distant he seemed, the more insecure Jessica felt. This was a vicious cycle heading toward relationship destruction. Then, Jessica learned about emotional self-sufficiency. She started working on meeting her own need for reassurance. Instead of asking Daniel if he loved her, she'd write in a journal about why she was lovable regardless of any relationship. She'd list her strengths, her accomplishments, her positive qualities. She'd remind herself that her worth wasn't determined by Daniel's feelings. Slowly, Jessica's constant need for external validation decreased. Daniel noticed the change immediately. Jessica seemed more confident, more independent, more secure in herself. And paradoxically, this made Daniel more attracted to her. He'd been pulled away by her neediness, but he was drawn toward her confidence. Their relationship strengthened because Jessica had stopped requiring Daniel to constantly validate her worth. She was emotionally self-sufficient. The second principle is outcome independence. This means that while you work toward your goals and preferences, you don't attach your emotional state to whether you achieve them. You prefer that people treat you with respect, but you don't need them to in order to maintain your self-respect. You want your projects to succeed, but you don't need them to in order to feel successful. Let me tell you about Robert, a 44-year-old sales director from Leeds. Robert had built his entire identity around his professional success. He was the top salesperson in his company. His income, his status, his self-worth were all tied to his sales numbers. Then the company hired a new salesperson named Tom, a 26-year-old graduate from Warwick Business School. Tom was brilliant, energetic, and hungry to succeed. Within 6 months, Tom's sales numbers were approaching Robert's. Robert felt threatened. His identity was being challenged. If he wasn't the top salesperson, who was he? Robert's emotional state became tied to whether he could maintain his lead over Tom. He'd check the sales dashboard obsessively. If he was ahead, he felt elated. If Tom had a better week, Robert felt depressed. This emotional dependence on maintaining his ranking was making Robert miserable. Then Robert discovered outcome independence. He realized he could still be committed to excellent sales performance without attaching his identity and self-worth to whether he was ranked first. Robert started focusing on process rather than outcomes. Was he doing high-quality work? Was he serving clients well? Was he developing his skills? Was he being the kind of professional he respected? Robert could control those things. He couldn't control whether Tom or anyone else outsold him. Once Robert detached his emotional well-being from the sales rankings, something remarkable happened. He actually became more effective. The anxiety and pressure he'd been carrying had been subtly undermining his performance. Once he released that pressure, his natural talents emerged more fully. His sales numbers improved. But more importantly, Robert was happy again. Same job, better emotional experience, because he'd achieved outcome independence. The third principle is identity independence. This means that your sense of who you are is not dependent on external roles, achievements, or other people's opinions. You know who you are at your core, and that identity remains stable regardless of changing circumstance. Many people derive their identity from their job, their relationships, their possessions, or their achievements. When these external things change or are threatened, their sense of self becomes unstable. They take criticism personally because they see it as an attack on their identity. They get defensive when challenged because they feel their worth is being questioned. Let me tell you about Catherine, a 52-year-old headmistress at a prestigious boarding school in Surrey. For 25 years, Catherine had been the headmistress. That was her identity. That was who she was. Her entire sense of self was wrapped up in this role and the respect it commanded. Then the school's board of governors decided to move in a different direction. They wanted someone younger, focused on technology integration. Catherine was offered early retirement with a generous package. Logically, she understood this was a reasonable business decision, but emotionally, she was devastated. If she wasn't the headmistress, who was she? Catherine fell into a deep depression. She'd lost not just a job, but her identity. Through counseling, Catherine learned about identity independence. She began to understand that being a headmistress was what she did, not who she was. Her core identity, her values, her character, her capability, those existed independently of any role or title. Catherine started reconnecting with aspects of herself that had nothing to do with her professional role. She'd always loved painting, but had abandoned it for career demands. She rekindled that passion. She'd been a dedicated educator, but that didn't require being a headmistress. She started volunteering to tutor underprivileged children in Croydon. Catherine discovered that their identity wasn't dependent on external roles. She was a person of worth, creativity, and contribution regardless of her job title. This identity independence freed her from the depression and allowed her to enjoy a fulfilling retirement she never would have thought possible. The fourth principle is boundary mastery. Emotional independence requires clear boundaries between yourself and others. You need to know where you end and they begin. You need to distinguish between their emotions and your emotions, their problems and your problems, their responsibilities and your responsibilities. Many people struggle with emotional boundaries. They take on other people's emotions as if they were their own. They feel guilty when others are unhappy, even when they're not responsible for that unhappiness. They feel obligated to fix other people's problems or manage their emotional states. Let me tell you about Daniel, a 38-year-old social worker from Glasgow. Daniel was exceptionally compassionate, which made him excellent at his job. But his lack of boundaries was destroying him. When his clients were struggling, Daniel felt their pain as if it were his own. He'd lie awake at night, worrying about them. He'd feel guilty when he couldn't solve their problems. He'd take on emotional responsibility for situations that were beyond his control. Daniel was experiencing what's called compassion fatigue. He was burning out because he couldn't separate his emotional state from his clients' emotional states. Daniel's supervisor referred him to a counselor who specialized in helping professionals maintain healthy boundaries. The counselor taught Daniel that he could care deeply about his clients without taking responsibility for their emotional well-being. He could empathize with their pain without absorbing it. He could support them through difficulties without feeling obligated to solve all their problems. Daniel learned to say to himself, "I can be present with this person's pain without making it my pain. I can care about their well-being without being responsible for their happiness." This boundary allowed Daniel to continue doing compassionate work without destroying himself in the process. Healthy boundaries actually made Daniel more effective at his job because he had the emotional reserves to fully engage with clients rather than being depleted by emotional absorption. The fifth principle is present moment awareness. Emotional independence is easier to maintain when you're focused on the present rather than ruminating about the past or worrying about the future. Most emotional reactivity comes from mental time travel. You replay past hurts and imagine future threats. You carry grudges from yesterday and anxieties about tomorrow. When you anchor yourself in the present moment, you're dealing only with what's actually happening right now, not with all the stories and projections your mind creates. Let me tell you about Mohammed, a 42-year-old train conductor on the London Underground. Mohammed's job required constant alertness and presence, but his mind was often elsewhere. He'd replay arguments with his ex-wife from months ago. He'd worry about his daughter's university applications. He'd stress about mortgage payments. This mental time travel made Mohammed constantly anxious and irritable. Small annoyances, a passenger asking questions, a delay in the schedule, would trigger disproportionate emotional reactions because Mohammed's mind was already full of past regrets and future worries. Then Mohammed discovered mindfulness meditation through a free class offered at his local community center in Brixton. The core practice was simple. Bring your attention to the present moment. Notice your breath. Notice physical sensations. Notice what's actually happening right now. When your mind wanders to past or future, gently bring it to the present. Mohammed started practicing for just 5 minutes each morning before his shift. The impact was profound. When Mohammed kept his attention anchored in the present, he could handle challenging situations calmly. A difficult passenger was just a difficult passenger in this moment, not evidence of a terrible day or a source of stress to carry forward. A schedule delay was just a delay to manage now, not a catastrophe to worry about. Mohammed's colleagues noticed the change. "You seem more relaxed," they'd say. Mohammed was doing the exact same job under the exact same pressures, but his experience was completely different because he was present rather than lost in mental time travel. Now let's talk about specific types of difficult people you'll encounter and the exact strategies for maintaining emotional control with each type. Not all difficult people are created equal. There are 4 specific personality types that consistently trigger emotional reactions in others, and each type requires a different approach. Let me introduce you to these archetypes through real people I've worked with. The first archetype is the aggressive dominator. Let me tell you about how Aisha, a 27-year-old barrister from Birmingham, learned to handle these individuals. Aisha worked at a chambers on Temple in London. One of the senior barristers, a man named Richard Ashford QC, was notorious for his aggressive style. He'd shout at junior barristers during case meetings. He'd interrupt presentations. He'd dismiss ideas with cutting sarcasm. Most junior barristers were terrified of him. Aisha's initial strategy was to try to avoid Richard entirely. But that wasn't sustainable in a small chambers. Then Aisha tried matching his aggressive energy, arguing back forcefully. That made things worse. Richard seemed to enjoy the conflict and would escalate further. Finally, Aisha learned the key to handling aggressive dominators. Don't match their energy, and don't retreat. Instead, maintain absolute calm and speak in a lower, slower tone than normal. This has a neurological effect. Instead of catching their aggressive energy, you project calm. That can actually lower their arousal level. The next time Richard started shouting during a meeting, Aisha took a breath. She maintained steady eye contact. She kept her body language open but grounded, and in a calm, measured voice, she said, "I understand this case is important to you, Richard. I want to find the best strategy we can. Let me explain my reasoning." Her calm tone and refusal to engage in the power struggle completely disarmed Richard. He couldn't maintain his aggressive energy when Aisha wasn't fighting back or retreating. Within 2 minutes, the meeting had shifted from confrontation to collaboration. Other junior barristers watched in amazement. Aisha had done what none of them had managed. She'd stayed calm in Richard's storm. The second archetype is the passive-aggressive manipulator. Let me tell you about Stuart, a 34-year-old IT manager from Manchester, who mastered dealing with these individuals. Stuart had a colleague named Brian, who was a satyr of passive aggression. Brian would agree to help with projects, but then forget repeatedly. He'd make cutting jokes at Stuart's expense, and then say he was just kidding when Stuart objected. He'd complain about Stuart to other colleagues, but never address issues directly. This behavior was making Stuart furious. Stuart would confront Brian directly. "You said you'd help with the database migration. Why didn't you?" Brian would respond with feigned innocence. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. I thought someone else was handling that." Stuart felt like he was going crazy. He knew Brian was deliberately undermining him, but Brian's behavior was so ambiguous that Stuart couldn't prove it. The strategy for passive-aggressive manipulators is radical transparency and boundary setting. Stuart learned to call out the behavior directly and calmly. "Brian, I've noticed a pattern. The last 4 times you've agreed to help something, it hasn't happened. I need to understand if you're genuinely willing to help or if I should make other arrangements." This direct naming of the pattern, without accusatory emotion, made it harder for Brian to deflect. More importantly, Stuart stopped relying on Brian entirely. He found alternative solutions that didn't depend on Brian's cooperation. Without Stuart's emotional reactions to feed on, Brian's behavior became irrelevant. Brian could be as passive-aggressive as he wanted. It no longer affected Stuart, because Stuart had removed Brian's power to impact his work or emotional state. The third archetype is the emotional vampire. Let me tell you about how Eleanor, a 49-year-old GP in Cardiff, learned to handle these individuals. Eleanor had a patient named Mrs. Davies, who came to the surgery constantly with minor complaints. But the real issue wasn't medical. Mrs. Davies was lonely and using medical appointments as social connection. She'd talk for 30 minutes about her aches and pains, her ungrateful children, her disappointing life. Eleanor would emerge from these appointments feeling completely drained. At first, Eleanor tried to fix all of Mrs. Davies's problems. She'd suggest arrangements, offer advice, make referrals, but nothing helped because Mrs. Davies didn't want solutions. She wanted endless attention and sympathy. The approach for emotional vampires is compassionate detachment. Eleanor learned to care about Mrs. Davies's well-being without taking responsibility for her emotional state. Eleanor started setting clear time boundaries. Mrs. Davies, I have 10 minutes of this appointment. Let's focus on your primary concern. When Mrs. Davies tried to expand into other topics, Eleanor would gently but firmly redirect. I understand that's concerning, but we need to stay focused on your blood pressure today. Eleanor stopped trying to solve problems. Mrs. Davies wasn't ready to solve. She'd offer one suggestion, and then move on. That sounds challenging. I hope you find a solution. Now, let's check your medication. This compassionate detachment allowed Eleanor to remain caring without being drained. She could be present for Mrs. Davies without absorbing her negativity. The fourth archetype is the narcissistic attention seeker. Let me tell you about Philip, a 31-year-old university lecturer at Durham, who mastered this. Philip had a colleague named Dr. James Whitmore, who monopolized every department meeting. James would interrupt others. He'd turn every discussion into stories about his own achievements. He'd exaggerate his publication record and research grants. Most faculty found James insufferable, but no one knew how to handle him without creating conflict. Philip tried correcting James's exaggerations once. James became hostile and made Philip's life difficult for months. Philip realized that confronting narcissistic attention seekers directly often backfires because it provides the drama and attention they crave. The strategy is strategic disengagement. Philip learned to give James brief, polite acknowledgement, and then redirect attention elsewhere. When James would launch into another self-aggrandizing story, Philip would say, "That's interesting, James," and then immediately turn to someone else. "Sarah, what do you think about this proposal?" This technique prevented James from dominating the conversation without creating confrontation. Philip focused on connecting with other colleagues rather than managing James's behavior. Over time, as the department learned from Philip's example, James's influence diminished. He still sought attention, but he no longer got it as reliably. The most powerful response to narcissistic attention-seeking is indifference, not conflict. When you've mastered the principles and techniques in this audiobook, you don't just handle difficult people better. You become a fundamentally different person. You develop what I call emotional unshakability, a deep inner stability that remains constant regardless of external circumstances. Let me tell you what happened to Thomas, the Manchester solicitor we met at the beginning. Remember, Thomas was the man who nearly destroyed his career and marriage because he couldn't control his anger. 6 months after Thomas started applying these principles, I had a follow-up session with him. The transformation was remarkable. Thomas told me about an incident that had happened the previous week. He was representing a client in a high-stakes property dispute. The opposing barrister had used some questionable tactics, bending procedural rules to gain advantage. The old Thomas would have exploded. He would have shouted objections. He would have filed formal complaints. He would have made the proceeding personal. But the new Thomas took a different approach. He noticed the emotional activation beginning. He felt his heart rate increasing, that familiar anger rising. But instead of reacting, he paused. 3 deep breaths. He reframed the situation. This wasn't a personal attack. This was just an opposing counsel using aggressive tactics. Thomas could respond strategically rather than emotionally. Thomas calmly documented each procedural irregularity. He filed appropriate objections with professional precision. He focused entirely on the legal merits, rather than getting drawn into personal conflict. The judge noticed Thomas's professionalism, and actually reprimanded the opposing counsel for their tactics. Thomas won the case decisively. But more importantly, Thomas maintained his composure throughout. He went home that evening, feeling calm and satisfied rather than angry and stressed. His wife Emma noticed immediately. "You handled that brilliantly," she said. "A year ago that situation would have had you raging for days." Thomas realized in that moment how far he'd come. The situation that would have hijacked him emotionally had become just another professional challenge to navigate skillfully. Let me tell you about Sarah, the Brighton teacher, who was convinced her colleague Emma was undermining her. Sarah started applying the personalization trap awareness. She began questioning her interpretations of Emma's behavior. Was Emma really targeting her personally, or was Sarah making Emma's professional questions about her? Sarah decided to try a radical experiment. She'd approach Emma as if they were colleagues rather than adversaries. Sarah started asking Emma for advice on teaching strategies. She'd share ideas and genuinely invite Emma's feedback. At first, Emma was surprised. But gradually, their relationship transformed. Sarah discovered that Emma was actually an incredibly valuable colleague. Her questions weren't attacks. They were the product of a sharp analytical mind that identified potential problems early. Sarah and Emma became collaborative partners. The woman Sarah had seen as her enemy became one of her closest professional allies. All because Sarah stopped personalizing Emma's behavior. These transformations aren't unique. I've watched hundreds of people apply these principles and experience similar results. Their relationships improve dramatically because they're no longer contributing to emotional escalation and drama. They become calming influences that help others regulate their own emotions. Their professional success accelerates because they're seen as people who can handle responsibility, pressure, and leadership challenges. They make better decisions because their thinking isn't clouded by emotional reactivity. Their physical health improves because they're no longer subjecting their bodies to chronic stress hormones. Their mental clarity increases because they're not wasting mental energy on rumination and resentment. Perhaps most importantly, they develop a deep sense of personal freedom. They realize that no one can make them feel anything without their permission. No situation can force them into emotional reactivity unless they choose to react. No person can control their inner experience unless they give them that power. This freedom isn't loneliness or disconnection. They can still love deeply, feel passionate about causes, and experience the full range of human emotions. The difference is that they experience emotions consciously, rather than being overwhelmed by them. They choose their emotional responses rather than having them chosen by circumstances and other people's behavior. Let me leave you with one final story. This is about a man named Arthur, an 83-year-old retired schoolteacher from a small village in Yorkshire. Arthur attended one of my workshops because his grandson had bought him a ticket. Arthur was skeptical. "I'm 83 years old," he told me. "I've been getting angry at people for 8 decades. I don't think anything's going to change now." But Arthur decided to try the techniques anyway. He started with the pause protocol. The next time his neighbor played loud music, instead of immediately banging on the wall, Arthur paused 3 breaths. He reframed the situation. His neighbor wasn't being malicious. He was a young man who probably didn't realize the music was disturbing others. Arthur walked next door with a plate of biscuits he'd baked. "Hello, son," Arthur said kindly. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. I notice you enjoy your music. I wonder if you'd mind turning it down a bit in the evenings. These old walls don't provide much sound insulation." The young man was mortified. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea it was bothering you. I absolutely keep it down." He immediately reduced the volume and was conscientious about noise from that day forward. Arthur was amazed. This problem that had been making him furious for weeks had been solved with a kind conversation and some biscuits. Arthur started applying these principles to every area of his life. His relationship with his adult children improved because he stopped taking their busy schedules personally. His friendship with other retirees deepened because he stopped getting offended by minor slights. His overall happiness increased dramatically. 6 months later, Arthur wrote me a letter. "I thought I was too old to change," he wrote. "But I've discovered that I'm happier at 83 than I've been in decades. I wasted so many years being angry at people and situations I couldn't control. I wish I'd learned this 50 years ago. But I'm grateful I learned it now." If Arthur at 83 could transform his emotional patterns, so can you. Age, personality, past experiences, none of these determine your emotional future. Your emotional control is a skill that can be developed at any age, in any circumstances. You started this audiobook with a simple question: how can I stop being angry and bothered by other people? You now have the complete answer. You understand the 3 emotional traps that keep you reactive. You know the neuroscience of emotional hijacking. You've learned the pause protocol for interrupting reactions before they take control. You've mastered reframing techniques that change your emotional response by changing your interpretation. You've developed the detachment system for emotional independence. You know how to handle the 4 personality types that trigger everyone else. You have everything you need to become emotionally unshakable. But knowledge without implementation is just entertainment. The difference between people who understand these concepts and people who achieve these results lies entirely in their willingness to practice. Start today, not tomorrow, when you feel more motivated, not next week when your schedule is clearer. Today, choose one technique. Maybe it's the breath pause. Maybe it's the personalization trap. Awareness. Maybe it's emotional self-sufficiency. Choose one technique and commit to practicing it consistently for the next 30 days. When you master one technique, add another. Build your emotional control progressively, one skill at a time. Remember that perfection is not the goal. Progress is the goal. You will still have moments when you react emotionally. You will still have days when difficult people get to you. That's normal. That's human. What matters is that those moments become less frequent and less intense over time. What matters is that you recover more quickly when you do lose composure. What matters is that you learn from every experience and continuously refine your approach. The world needs people who have learned to stay calm in chaos and positive in the face of challenge. By doing this work for yourself, you're not just improving your own life. You're becoming a source of stability and peace for everyone whose life you touch. Your journey toward emotional unshakability starts now. The choice, as always, is yours. And I believe you'll make the right one. Because you didn't listen to this entire audiobook by accident. You listened because somewhere deep inside, you know you're capable of more. You know you deserve better than being controlled by other people's behavior. You know you're ready to take back your emotional freedom. So go forward with confidence. You have the knowledge. You have the techniques. You have everything you need. Now it's time to prove to yourself what you're truly capable of. I'll leave you with this final thought. The person who controls their emotions controls their destiny. Starting today, that person is you. Now that you understand the principles and techniques, let me give you a precise implementation roadmap. Most people fail to transform their emotional patterns, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack a systematic approach to practice. This 30-day roadmap will guide you through building emotional mastery step by step, ensuring that each skill becomes automatic before you add the next one. Let me tell you about Victoria, a 33-year-old project manager from Nottingham, who used this exact roadmap to transform her life. Victoria came to me after a particularly humiliating incident at work. During a project review meeting, a senior executive had criticized her timeline estimates. Victoria, feeling attacked, had responded defensively and emotionally. She'd raised her voice. She'd made excuses. She'd blamed other team members. The meeting had ended with the executive saying, "Victoria, I need you to be more professional in these discussions." Victoria was mortified. She knew she needed to change, but she didn't know where to start. I gave Victoria this 30-day roadmap, and she followed it precisely. The first week is entirely about developing awareness of your current emotional patterns. You're not trying to change anything yet. You're simply observing and documenting. Victoria started carrying a small note. Every time she felt emotionally activated during the day, she'd make a brief note. What triggered the emotion? What physical sensations did she notice? What thoughts went through her mind? How did she respond? By the end of the first week, Victoria had identified her 3 most common triggers: criticism of her work, feeling excluded from decisions, and time pressure combined with unclear instructions. She also noticed her physical warning signs. Her jaw would clench. Her shoulders would tense. Her breathing would become shallow. This awareness was crucial, because you can't change patterns you don't recognize. Let me tell you what Victoria discovered on day 4. She was in a meeting, and someone questioned her data. Victoria immediately felt defensive anger rising. But because she was now observing her reactions, she noticed something she'd never seen before. The anger wasn't actually about the data being questioned. It was about a deeper fear that people would think she was incompetent. This insight changed everything. Victoria realized that most of her emotional reactions weren't about the actual situations. They were about deeper fears and insecurities being triggered. Week 2 focuses exclusively on mastering the breath pause. This is your foundation skill. Without this, everything else becomes much harder. Victoria committed to practicing the breath pause 20 times per day. Regardless of whether she felt emotionally activated, she'd set reminders on her phone every hour. When the reminder went off, she'd stop whatever she was doing and practice. In through nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out through mouth for 6 counts. Repeat 3 times. At first, this felt mechanical and forced, but Victoria persisted. By day 10, something remarkable happened. Victoria was in her car, running late for an important client meeting. Traffic on the M1 was completely gridlocked. The old Victoria would have been gripping the steering wheel, swearing at other drivers. Arriving at the meeting stressed and frazzled. But this Victoria noticed the stress rising and automatically implemented the breath pause. 3 cycles of controlled breathing. Within 90 seconds, her nervous system had shifted from fight or flight to calm alertness. Victoria arrived at the meeting 15 minutes late, but completely composed. She apologized professionally, explained the traffic situation briefly, and then focused entirely on the client's needs. The meeting was a success. More importantly, Victoria had proof that the technique worked in real high-pressure situations. Week 3 introduces reframing, while maintaining your breath pause practice. Victoria learned to catch her automatic interpretations and generate alternatives. She created a reframing template in her phone notes. Whenever something triggered her, she'd write, situation, what actually happened. My initial story, what I'm telling myself this means. Alternative story 1, different interpretation. Alternative story 2, another possibility. Alternative story 3, yet another angle. Let me tell you about the breakthrough Victoria had on day 17. Her colleague James had taken credit for Victoria's idea. In a meeting with senior management, Victoria felt betrayed and furious. Her initial story was, James deliberately stole my idea to make himself look good. He's sabotaging me. Victoria was about to send a confrontational email to James, but she forced herself to use her reframing template first. Alternative story 1. James genuinely forgot this was my idea, because we discussed it informally. Alternative story 2. James is under pressure to demonstrate value and wasn't thinking clearly about attribution. Alternative story 3. James thought he was building on the idea rather than stealing it. Writing these alternatives didn't make Victoria's anger disappear immediately, but it created enough doubt about her initial interpretation that she paused before sending the confrontational email. Instead, Victoria scheduled a face-to-face conversation with James. James, I noticed you presented the customer segmentation approach in today's meeting. I'm glad the idea got visibility. For future reference, I'd appreciate if you could mention when ideas originated from our earlier conversations. It helps me demonstrate value to leadership. James was surprised. Oh God, Victoria, I'm so sorry. I didn't even think about attribution. That absolutely was your idea. I'll send a follow-up email to the group clarifying that. The situation that could have created lasting resentment was resolved amicably, because Victoria had reframed her interpretation before reacting. Week 4 focuses on reducing emotional dependence on external validation. Victoria started a daily practice of self-validation. Each evening, she'd write 3 things. Today, I demonstrated competence when. Today, I showed character when. Today, I deserve respect because. This wasn't about arrogance or inflating her ego. It was about developing internal sources of validation, so she wasn't dependent on others for her sense of worth. Let me tell you what Victoria wrote on day 20. Today I demonstrated competence when I identified the budget error before it became a project problem. Today I showed character when I admitted my timeline estimate was wrong rather than making excuses. Today I deserve respect because I treated everyone professionally, even when I was stressed. This daily practice of self-validation began changing Victoria's relationship with external feedback. When her manager praised her work, Victoria appreciated it but didn't need it desperately. When a colleague criticized her approach, Victoria could consider it objectively without feeling personally attacked. She was developing emotional self-sufficiency. The final 2 days are for reflection and planning. Victoria reviewed her notebook from the past 30 days. The changes were remarkable. Week 1. She documented 15 significant emotional reactions. Week 4. She'd documented only 3. And she'd handled all 3 with composure. Victoria created her ongoing practice plan. She'd continue the breath pause whenever she felt activation. She'd use reframing for situations that triggered strong reactions. She'd maintain daily self-validation. She'd review her emotional patterns weekly to identify areas for continued growth. Most importantly, Victoria had shifted her identity. She no longer saw herself as someone who had an anger problem. She saw herself as someone who was skilled at emotional regulation and continuously improving. 3 months after completing the 30-day roadmap, Victoria's manager pulled her aside. "I don't know what you've done differently, Victoria, but the change is remarkable. You've become one of the most reliable leaders on the team. You stay calm under pressure. You handle feedback gracefully. You're ready for greater responsibility." Victoria was promoted to senior project manager. But more valuable than the promotion was the inner confidence Victoria had developed. She knew she could handle difficult people and challenging situations without losing her composure. That knowledge was worth more than any title or salary increase. Let me now address the situations where emotional control becomes most difficult. These are the scenarios that test your skills to their limits. Betrayal by someone you trusted, public humiliation, threats to your livelihood, or personal attacks on your character. When I teach workshops, someone inevitably asks, "But what about when someone really crosses the line? What about when the situation is genuinely terrible and anger is justified?" Let me be clear. These techniques aren't about pretending that bad things aren't bad. They're about responding effectively rather than reactively, even when situations are genuinely terrible. Let me tell you about Christopher, a 49-year-old managing director at an investment firm in the City of London. Christopher discovered that his business partner of 15 years, a man named Graham whom Christopher had trusted completely, had been systematically embezzling funds from their firm. Over £300,000 had been stolen. Worse, Graham had created documentation that made it appear Christopher had authorized the questionable transactions. Christopher was facing potential criminal investigation for something he hadn't done. This wasn't a minor annoyance or a personality conflict. This was betrayal, financial devastation, and potential imprisonment. Christopher's solicitor told him the situation was serious. If Christopher couldn't prove his innocence, he could face charges. Christopher's initial emotional response was volcanic rage, combined with betrayal and fear. He wanted to physically confront Graham. He wanted to destroy Graham's reputation. He wanted revenge. For the first 48 hours, Christopher was completely consumed by these emotions. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. His mind spun with fantasies of confrontation and revenge. Then, in a moment of exhausted clarity, Christopher realized something crucial. His rage, however justified, was not going to solve his legal and financial problems. In fact, his rage was making it harder to think clearly about his actual options. Christopher needed to shift from reactive emotion to strategic response. Christopher implemented what I call the emergency protocol. First, physical reset. Christopher went to the gym and did the most intense workout of his life. 90 minutes of pushing his body to its limits. This wasn't about feeling better. It was about metabolizing the stress hormones flooding his system. Intense physical activity is one of the fastest ways to restore cognitive function after extreme emotional activation. Second, strategic reframing. Christopher forced himself to write out the situation in purely factual terms, separate from his emotional interpretation. Facts. Graham took money. Graham created false documentation. I need to prove I wasn't involved. Emotional interpretation. Graham is evil. I've been betrayed. My life is ruined. Christopher realized that the facts, while serious, were manageable. The emotional interpretation was what felt overwhelming. Third, outcome focus. Christopher asked himself, what outcome do I actually want here? Revenge. That would feel satisfying, but wouldn't solve his problems. His real desired outcome was clear his name, recover the funds if possible, protect his business, and ensure Graham faced legal consequences. Once Christopher clarified his desired outcomes, he could focus his energy strategically. He hired the best forensic accountant he could find. He cooperated fully with investigators. He documented every interaction he'd had with Graham regarding finances. He let his legal team handle the confrontation with Graham, while he focused on building his defense. Was Christopher still angry? Absolutely. But he wasn't being controlled by his anger. He was using his energy strategically, rather than emotionally. The resolution took 8 months. Christopher was completely cleared of any wrongdoing. Graham was convicted of fraud and sent to prison. Christopher recovered a significant portion of the stolen funds through civil proceedings. But more importantly, Christopher had learned that even in extreme situations, emotional control provides strategic advantages. If I'd acted on my initial rage, Christopher told me, I probably would have physically confronted Graham, which could have created legal problems for me. I might have made public accusations before I had proof, which could have exposed me to defamation liability. My rage, however justified, would have made my situation worse. Staying strategic saved me. Let me give you the emergency protocol that Christopher used, and that you can apply to any extreme situation. Step 1. Implement extended physical pause. Remove yourself completely from the situation. If possible, 24 to 72 hours of complete separation. During this time, do intense physical activity to metabolize stress hormones. Step 2. Document facts separately from emotional interpretation. Write down only what actual happened, like you're a neutral journalist reporting the event. This helps your rational brain come back online. Step 3. Identify your actual desired outcome. Not what would feel satisfying emotionally, but what would actually serve your long-term interests. Step 4. Consult trusted advisors. Not people who will just validate your anger, but people who will help you think strategically. Step 5. Develop and execute a plan based on outcomes rather than emotions. Let me tell you about another extreme situation. Amelia, a 37-year-old teacher from Liverpool, was falsely accused of inappropriate conduct with a student. The accusation was completely fabricated by a troubled student who was angry about receiving a failing grade, but the accusation still triggered a formal investigation. Amelia was suspended from her position pending the investigation's outcome. Amelia's reputation, career, and livelihood were all at stake. The false accusation felt like a violation almost beyond comprehension. Amelia's initial response was panic combined with rage. She wanted to confront the student. She wanted to publicly defend herself. She wanted everyone to know immediately that the accusation was false. But Amelia's union representative gave her crucial advice. I know you're innocent, but how you respond to this investigation will determine whether you can continue your career. You need to stay absolutely professional and cooperative. Amelia implemented the emergency protocol. She removed herself from the immediate situation, staying with her sister in Manchester. For a few days, she documented every interaction she'd ever had with the student in question. Purely factual accounts. She identified her desired outcome, complete exoneration, and returned to her position. She consulted with her union representative and a solicitor about the best strategic approach. She cooperated fully with investigators, while letting her representatives handle the confrontational aspects. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of uncertainty, stress, and fear. But Amelia maintained her composure throughout. The investigation completely exonerated her. The student eventually admitted to fabricating the accusation. Amelia was reinstated with a formal apology from the school administration. If I had reacted emotionally, Amelia told me, if I had confronted the student or made public accusations, or been anything less than completely professional, it could have complicated the investigation. My emotional control during the worst 3 weeks of my life protected my career. These extreme situations reveal an important truth. Emotional control isn't just for minor irritations and personality conflicts. It's most valuable precisely when situations are most serious and stakes are highest. Let me conclude by talking about what lies beyond basic emotional competence. Most people, once they've achieved reasonable emotional control, stop developing. They reach a level where they're no longer being sabotaged by their reactions, and they're satisfied. But there's another level available, what I call emotional mastery. This is where emotional control becomes so natural that it requires no conscious effort. where you automatically see situations from multiple perspectives, where other people's behavior genuinely doesn't trigger you because you understand it so deeply, where you become a source of calm and clarity for everyone around you. Let me tell you about Dr. Rajesh Patel, a 68-year-old consultant physician at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. Dr. Patel has practiced medicine for 42 years. He's dealt with every imaginable high-stress situation, difficult patients, medical emergencies, ethical dilemmas, bureaucratic frustrations, colleagues with challenging personalities. I had the opportunity to shadow Dr. Patel for a day as part of a research project on emotional resilience in healthcare. What I observed was remarkable. Dr. Patel encountered situations that would have stressed most people significantly. A patient's family member shouting at him about treatment delays, a junior doctor making a concerning error, a disagreement with a colleague about patient care, an emergency situation where a patient's life hung in balance. In each situation, Dr. Patel remained completely calm, not suppressing emotions, not pretending everything was fine, but genuinely composed and present. I asked him afterwards, "How do you stay so calm? Do you use specific techniques?" Dr. Patel smiled. "I used to use techniques consciously, the breathing exercises, the reframing, all of that. But after many years of practice, it's become automatic. I don't think about staying calm anymore. I just am calm." It's like asking a master pianist how they play a complex piece. At first, it requires conscious attention to every note. Eventually, your hands know what to do without conscious thought. Emotional mastery is the same. This is the level available to you with sustained practice. Your emotional regulation skills can become so automatic that they require no conscious effort. You don't have to remember to pause and breathe. Your nervous system naturally maintains equilibrium. You don't have to consciously reframe situations. Your mind automatically generates multiple interpretations. You don't have to work at emotional self-sufficiency. You simply are emotionally self-sufficient. This mastery level typically requires years of consistent practice, but the journey itself is valuable. Every step toward greater emotional control improves your life quality, even before you reach complete mastery. Dr. Patel shared one more insight that's crucial for your continued development: the paradox of emotional mastery. He said, is that the more skilled you become, the less you need the skills. When you're truly unshakable, life provides fewer and fewer situations that test you. It's as if the universe recognizes that you've learned the lessons and stops providing the same tests. Your external life becomes calmer because your internal state is calm. This has been my observation as well. People who develop deep emotional mastery often find that their lives become naturally less chaotic, not because external circumstances change dramatically, but because they stop creating and amplifying drama through their reactions. Let me leave you with a final framework for your continued development beyond these 30 days. This is the 5 levels of emotional mastery. Level 1 is unconscious reactivity. This is where most people operate, completely at the mercy of their emotional reactions. No awareness of choice. Level 2 is conscious reactivity. You're aware you're having an emotional reaction, but you choose to act on it anyway. You justify your reactivity. Level 3 is conscious response. You feel the emotion, but you consciously choose your response based on your values and goals. This is where most people who complete the 30-day roadmap will arrive. Level 4 is automatic response. Your emotional regulation skills have become so practiced that you respond constructively without conscious effort. This is where Dr. Patel operates. Level 5 is emotional alchemy. This is the most advanced level. Not only do you control your responses to emotions, but you can actually transform the emotions themselves. You can take anger and transmute it into motivation. You can take fear and transform it into excitement. You can take sadness and convert it into deeper appreciation for what you still have. This level is rare, but attainable with extended practice. The goal isn't to reach level 5 immediately. The goal is to progress consistently from wherever you are now. If you're at level 1, work toward level 2 by developing awareness. If you're at level 2, work toward level 3 by choosing responses. Each level represents significant improvement in your quality of life and effectiveness. Your emotional mastery journey is lifelong. There's always deeper understanding available, always greater skill to develop, always more subtle aspects of emotional control to refine. But this journey is also immediately rewarding. You don't have to wait until you reach complete mastery to benefit. Every technique you apply improves your life today. Every reaction you successfully regulate creates immediate positive results. Every situation you handle with composure, rather than reactivity, builds your confidence and capability. You have everything you need to begin. The knowledge, the techniques, the roadmap, the examples. What remains is simply the decision to begin and the commitment to continue. Your emotionally unshakable future is waiting. All you have to do is take the first step. And that step begins right now.